So, when you are determining hyper amendments, then how did the courts arrive at that determination? Is it stated in law? Is there a given law where you have a threshold as to how many amendments you can make to the Constitution at a go and still be and the amendments be valid within the Constitution? Um, I think that ought to have been clarified, because what is the harm in having several amendments as long as the Constitution is observed as provided, or the existing law on amendments are not violated? I know that a lot was said about um, philosophies, constitutional philosophies, such as the unconstitutional constitutional amendments. Such philosophies were floated around in courts. Unconstitutional constitutional amendments. So, at what point can we say that 40 amendments to the Constitution are hyper amendments, and therefore they cannot be valid as expressed by the primary, as expressed through the primary, the secondary constituent power? I mean, if you are using the phraseology of the Basic Structure Doctrine. So how did the courts determine that if I'm to amend the Constitution using if I'm to amend the Constitution and I have several amendments to make to the Constitution, at what point do my proposal my proposal for amendments graduate to become proposal for hyper amendments, and therefore should be exercised by the primary constituent power? So I think when the courts used that as a step towards declaring a nullity to the BBI process, they voided and declared it null because they feel that it ought to have been exercised under the primary constituent power with the four sequential steps intact, and not the secondary constituent power as understood by Articles 255 to 257. That it's a violation, because, like it or not, if we are to have a new constitution, you'll see the four sequential steps come in. We will have constituent assemblies, we'll have civic education, we'll have public participation, then we'll have a referendum. Like it or not, those four steps are there, and they'll be there. But under what circumstances does BBI become akin to making a new constitution? Is there a threshold? Can the law state that if you are to make, for instance, 20 amendments to the Constitution, then they become hyper amendments? Can there be a framework to guide the process such that we are not in this situation again? Because what the courts did actually, it's textbook legislation on the bench, from the bench. It's textbook legislation from the bench. They have discovered a lacuna, and now they're, in law, there, when you have no applicable, there's never a vacuum. The assumption in law is that there is no vacuum when you're applying the law. So the courts assumed that there's a vacuum, and they cured the vacuum using the basic structure doctrine. Since there is no guidance as to how many amendments you can make at a go, the courts sought refuge in the basic structure doctrine. So it was like fool's gold to them, so that they ran to it, so that they can declare the process as one which ought to have been conducted by the primary constituent power, and therefore make it a nullity. So I think that, so it sounded, the basic structure doctrine became a go-to. But in my submission, I think it was an overreach in its powers. It's an overreach because if there is no elaborate framework furthering Articles 255 to 257, then how guided was the High Court in reverting back to, not reverting, but rather seeking refuge from the basic structure doctrine? That's the question. Such that if you have like 20-30 amendments to make, then it has reached it has crossed over to being hyper amendments, and therefore you need to undertake this process through the primary constituent power. So which law, while the basic structure doctrine applies, while it can be contended that it applies, basically because those processes, those steps are not foreign to our jurisdiction, though it is not stated verbatim that they are a basic structure doctrine. Those steps are there. But how guided were the courts to say that, look here, you are making about 40 amendments, and therefore you are crossing into the region of hyper amendments, and as such you need to undertake the exercise through the primary constituent power, such that the provisions of Article 255 to Article 257 do not suffice. It is like, and then what framework did they use to determine that hyper amendments is same as making a new constitution. So what is the threshold for hyper amendments? Is making hyper amendments similar to making a new constitution, such that the 4 sequential steps are supposed to be undertaken. So you can only apply the basic structure doctrine to the extent that it complies with the Constitution. And to some extent it does. To some extent it does. But to the extent that the application blatantly ignores the provisions of the Constitution prescribing amendments to itself are not followed, then the basic structure doctrine becomes elevated above and beyond the Constitution. Thank you.